Beneath the sunlit streets of the empire, far below the temples and markets, something ancient waited. A hollow so vast it swallowed sound. A place built not for men but for fear. Slaves were herded into chains, their faces pale with dread, yet unaware of what truly watched. Torches flickered along the jagged walls, barely lighting the shadows that moved independently of anyone or anything alive. The arena was colossal. Stone seats curved into darkness, stretching farther than the eye could see. In the center, the floor was stained red, not by dirt but by centuries of blood. Not all of it human. Priests whispered as they passed, their chants strange and warped, like the echo of an ancient language that no one living should remember. The slaves didn't fight for glory. They fought for survival. They fought for the briefest spark of attention from the gods below, who grew stronger with every scream. When the first fight began, a silence fell. Not the quiet of a hall empty of sound, but a pressing, living silence, as if the air itself waited with bated breath. Steel met steel. Flesh met stone. The gods watched. And somewhere in the dark recesses beneath the arena, a pulse stirred, ancient, patient, and hungry. One slave moved differently from the rest. Not faster, not stronger, but somehow he survived. The priests noticed first. A shadow crossed their chanting. A heartbeat skipped. And in that pause the gods took notice. The arena beneath the earth was no longer just a pit. It was a stage. And the game had just begun. Pain was the criterion. Not strength. Not skill. Not courage. Pain alone chose the slaves worthy of the arena. It was whispered among the prisoners, quietly, so the overseers did not hear. They feel the screams. They choose those who hurt the most. The new arrivals were terrified men and women, their faces pale under the torchlight. Each step down the stone corridors echoed endlessly, swallowed by shadows that seemed to shift with malevolence. The walls themselves were slick as if soaked in sweat or blood, not their own. When they reached the selection chamber, silence overtook them. No priests, no spectators. Only a pit of glowing red light at the center, faint and pulsating, like a heart beating underground. From the darkness, a voice whispered, not loud enough to be heard clearly, but somehow inside the mind of each prisoner. Only those who can bear the pain, survive. The first to be chosen fell to his knees. He did not scream. Not at first. The overseers did not intervene. They had learned long ago that resistance was meaningless, that fear alone could be broken. And then it began. A single strike. A rope tightening around the wrist, bone grinding beneath it. A blade slicing the skin, but not deep enough to kill. Pain, calibrated, deliberate, infinite. The chosen ones did not die. They were broken. The others were not. The chamber revealed its true nature. Walls closed in slowly, imperceptibly, so the air thickened. The cries of pain were drawn upward, absorbed by unseen forces. Something ancient was feeding on suffering. Hours passed. Days perhaps. Time became meaningless in the chamber. Hunger and thirst were secondary to the agony of mental torment. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes that mimicked the slaves' worst fears. Eyes appeared where no eyes should exist. Hands reached from the stone, brushing against trembling flesh. Every scream, every shiver, every internal cry for mercy was recorded. The arena itself was alive. Remembered, marked. Only those marked by pain would step onto the arena floor. Some tried to resist. Some begged, cried, or struck out. It did not matter. The chamber was patient. It did not falter. It waited for those who endured, the ones who could survive every imaginable torment without succumbing. And the chosen few, they began to change. Not in body at first, but in mind. Pain sharpened them. Awareness grew. They could sense the watchers in the darkness, the things beneath the arena, the silent hunger of the gods themselves. When the chamber finally opened, and the chosen stumbled onto the arena floor, they were not the same. The gods had noticed. The world above had no idea. And in that moment, one thing became terrifyingly clear. The arena was not punishment. It was preparation for what was coming next. Silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something infinitely older. Something that understood the heartbeat of every living thing. Something that consumed attention rather than flesh. The arena lay beneath the empire like a wound in the earth, yet the watchers were everywhere. Not visible, not even audible, but felt. a gaze that pressed on the soul as if reality itself was bending to observe. The chosen slaves stumbled across the blood-stained floor, their limbs heavy, their minds frayed. Every movement echoed, not into stone but into a void that responded. The air shifted, shadows deepened, and within those shadows, eyes. Countless eyes, blinking in rhythm with the slaves' pulses. No god spoke, no god moved. Yet every act of suffering, every tremor of fear was noted, stored, remembered. The priests whispered amongst themselves, voices trembling. They see everything. They are patient. They have waited since before men walked this earth. Hours stretched like centuries. Time warped. A drum of distant, impossible rhythm pulsed through the stone walls, heartbeat? Or the pulse of the gods themselves? The slaves could not tell. Some tried to scream. Some tried to fight the unseen weight. But the silence devoured sound. Their own thoughts turned against them. Pain, terror, guilt, shame, they all amplified, feeding the invisible presence. It was not a question of survival. It was a test of attention. Every stolen glance, every hesitation, every flicker of hope was measured, catalogued, and stored in the ancient memory of the watchers. And then the subtle horrors began. A shadow stretched across a wall, not matching anything in the room. Whispers filled the ear that had no mouth to speak them. The ground shivered underfoot as if the earth itself was breathing with them. The chosen learned quickly, the gods did not need speech. They communicated through fear, anticipation, and the shaping of reality itself. A broken leg was not punishment, it was an instruction. A sudden collapse was guidance. Every wound, every fall, every heartbeat that skipped a second was part of a language beyond comprehension. Some of the slaves began to see visions. Cities folding into impossible angles. Faces of ancestors they had never known staring in judgment. The sky above splitting into impossible geometric shapes. And still silence. The silence was the loudest thing of all. Those who endured began to whisper to each other, half in hope, half in madness. Do you feel it too? They are watching us. Yes, they were watching. And the longer the chosen endured, the more aware they became. They began to sense the rhythm beneath the stone, the pulse beneath the earth, the watching beyond death. Eventually, some dared to move in ways not expected. They stepped differently, breathed differently, thought differently, and in doing so they realized the gods did not simply watch. They learned, they remembered, and through the memory of fear, they could bend reality to prepare for something far larger than mere combat. By the end of the first cycle, the chosen were no longer merely slaves. They were instruments in a game played across centuries. And the gods, still silent, were smiling in ways that could not be perceived, only felt in the marrow. The arena had ceased to be just stone and blood. It had become a classroom of terror, a forge where minds were broken and reforged to anticipate the unthinkable. By the time the first moon of the empire rose above the surface, the chosen understood a terrifying truth. The gods did not need flesh. They only needed obedience. And in the silence, they commanded every thought, every fear, every action. The watchers were patient, and their patience would not end until the ultimate game began. He should have been dead. The first blow had shattered his shoulder. The second had split his skull. By the time the third strike came, the blood around him had turned into a crimson river, staining the stone arena. Yet he rose again. The priests murmured, their voices trembling. Impossible, he should not walk. He should not breathe. The other slaves stared. Fear twisted their faces. Whispers ran through the arena like poison. He is marked by them, the gods themselves. Pain had no dominion over him. Wounds healed, or perhaps something worse than healing consumed them, replacing the broken flesh with something unholy, something sharpened by suffering itself. The gods remained silent, their eyes unseen but everywhere. Each strike the slave endured seemed to please them. Each scream he swallowed became a tribute to the ancient, hungry watchers beneath the earth. And yet, the arena began to shift around him. Stone walls seemed to breathe. Shadows lengthened, curling like living things. Blood pooled unnaturally, moving toward the corners of the arena as though drawn by the gods themselves. He was no longer just a man. He had become a symbol, a mistake the gods did not anticipate. Other slaves fought desperately, some against him, some for survival. But every clash, every fall, every cry seemed irrelevant. The gods had chosen him, and in their patient silence, They whispered through the arena itself. Prepare. The game has changed. The priests began to panic. Ancient rituals that had been enough for centuries were failing. Candles burned backward. Incense smoldered into shadows that coiled around walls, forming grotesque shapes that watched the rebel with intelligent malice. Outside, the Empire slept, oblivious to the horror beneath their feet. Within the arena, the Chosen realized something terrifying. The slave who could not die was learning. He remembered every strike, every scream, every fear. He adapted. He understood the subtle signals in the arena, the tiny shifts of stone, the flicker of torchlight, the unnatural pattern in shadows. Hours became days. Days became nights. Pain became rhythm. Fear became strategy. The other slaves began to follow him, not because he commanded them, but because survival radiated from him like heat. By the time the first blood moon rose above the surface, the arena had been transformed. The gods who had once only watched now leaned closer, intrigued. The impossible had occurred. One human, broken and battered, had become something beyond their design. The priests whispered urgently, "We have awoken something we cannot control. He is no longer mortal. He is ours to watch." The arena trembled beneath the weight of what was coming. The slave who would not die had become the axis of fear, the pivot around which the gods themselves might be tested. And somewhere, in the dark corners of the earth, in the silent halls of ancient power, the watchers leaned forward, curious, hungry, patient. The game was no longer survival. It was defiance. And the gods, silent as ever, were ready to see how far it would go. Chains clanged. Not just the metal that bound wrists and ankles, but the chains that gripped minds, hearts, and fear itself. The arena had waited centuries for obedience. It had fed on screams, despair, and silence. Yet tonight, something shifted. The slave who would not die stood in the center. Every wound he had suffered glowed faintly under the torchlight, as though his pain had been absorbed and returned stronger, sharper. Around him, other slaves trembled, broken in body and spirit, but their eyes held something new, hope. The first act of rebellion was small. A single slave, battered and trembling, refused to kneel before the overseers. The chains around his wrists, ancient, enchanted, unyielding, snapped. The sound was not just metal breaking. It was a pulse through the arena, resonating in the stones, echoing into the depths where the gods themselves watched. The priests gasped. The overseers froze. And the gods, silent for centuries, shifted. Every step in the arena seemed to amplify. Shadows swirled unnaturally, flickering, coiling, as if the air itself acknowledged the impossible. The broken chains were more than freedom, they were a signal. The Chosen began to rise. Pain became defiance. Fear became courage. Every act of survival was no longer just for oneself. It was a statement against the ancient order. The arena itself seemed to respond. Stone walls groaned. Torches sputtered and flickered. Blood pooled and rippled unnaturally, tracing pathways toward the broken slaves, as though the arena itself fed off the courage born of pain. And then the first strike came, not from the overseers, not from the priests, but from the arena. A hidden mechanism released, sending spikes from the floor. The slaves had no time to react, but they moved as one. They were no longer just individuals. They were a force shaped by pain, honed by suffering, and guided by the impossible will of the indestructible slave. The gods leaned closer, their unseen presence pressing on the minds of the slaves. Each move was noted, each defiance recorded. They had never witnessed this. Mortals rebelling, surviving, adapting. Hours passed, or perhaps centuries. Time became meaningless in the arena. The first broken chain inspired others. More snaps echoed across the stone corridors. Chains fell to the ground like rain. Each one a testament to the awakening courage that no god could suppress. The priests whispered frantic prayers, words of old magic meant to control, to bend, to destroy. Yet the magic faltered. The slaves were no longer only flesh and bone. They were symbols, embodiments of resistance against the unseen watchers. And at the center, the slave who would not die watched it all unfold. He had become more than man. He had become the spark that would ignite a rebellion centuries in the making. The arena trembled. Shadows twisted. The silence of the gods deepened, but curiosity replaced patience. The first broken chain had shattered more than metal. It had shattered centuries of obedience, fear, and expectation. And the arena, and all who watched, knew. The game had changed. The arena was no longer a pit of despair. It had become a battlefield of defiance. The first broken chain had set a spark. Now, the chosen moved as one, staggering through blood-soaked stone corridors, their chains left behind like shattered memories. Every step echoed like a drumbeat across the ancient arena, and in the shadows the gods leaned closer, silent but aware. Outside the arena the Empire slept. Streets glimmered with the last embers of candles, unaware of the horror stirring beneath their feet. But within, the slaves marched, not as individuals, but as a single force born of pain, fear, and impossible endurance. The priests screamed. Rituals that had bound the arena's magic for centuries failed. Candles burned backward. Incense rose into coils of smoke that twisted unnaturally, forming shapes too grotesque for human eyes. The slaves pressed forward, undeterred. Pain had taught them rhythm. Fear had sharpened their senses. The arena itself seemed to open its stone jaws, guiding them toward the unknown. And then the Watchers revealed themselves, not fully, not visibly, but in terrifying tremors through the walls. The gods whispered through stone and air, a pressure on minds that made the blood run cold. The slaves felt it, the weight of eons watching them, but they did not falter. The march was not without cost. Some fell, consumed by the arena's traps or the gods' silent manipulations. Others, however, rose again, reborn from their agony. The slave who would not die led them, a beacon in the chaos, untouched by strikes that should have killed him. Hours bled into days, or perhaps centuries. The concept of time was meaningless beneath the earth. The gods, intrigued and impatient, began to bend reality subtly. Shadows moved independently, walls twisted, whispers echoed backwards, and the air grew thick with a cold that gnawed at the marrow. Yet the slaves advanced. Every fallen comrade became fuel, every scream a drumbeat guiding the march. The first steps into the arena had sparked rebellion. These steps into the depths ignited it fully. The priests realized their mistakes too late. Magic meant to control now fed the defiance, accelerating the awakening of the chosen. They were no longer merely fighting to survive. They were becoming instruments of something far larger, something the gods themselves had not foreseen. At the heart of the arena, the pulse of ancient power throbbed, reacting to the march. It was as though the earth itself knew a reckoning was coming. The gods watched silently, but even their patience was strained. They had created obedience, but they had not accounted for courage born from absolute suffering. By the end of the first full cycle of the march, the slaves had transformed. Not all of them alive, but all of them changed, carrying within them the fire of defiance that no god could extinguish. The arena trembled. Blood flowed freely across its floor, and the shadows writhed like living creatures. A prophecy long forgotten whispered through the stone. The damned will rise, the Watchers will learn, and the chains of the earth will break. The gods waited. The empire above remained ignorant, and the march of the damned continued, unstoppable, unbroken, and terrifyingly alive. Silence shattered. Not with sound, not with thunder, not with lightning, but with thought. The gods, patient for centuries, finally made themselves known, not in flesh but in the minds of the damned. The march had reached the heart of the arena, the deepest pit where stone met void. The slaves, exhausted, broken, yet unyielding, felt a shift in reality. Walls pulsed. Shadows danced. The air grew thick, heavy, almost liquid. And then it came, a presence. A weight upon the mind, a pressure that pressed against every thought, every heartbeat, every memory. It was not angry. It was curious. It was ancient beyond comprehension. The slaves froze, terror washing over them like a tidal wave. Whispers echoed inside their skulls, not words but ideas. Concepts, feelings, commands. You have endured. You have survived. Now we see. The slave who would not die stepped forward. Every wound he had ever suffered flared in his mind, a map of pain. He felt the gods watching, not just observing but learning, measuring, shaping. A low vibration thrummed through the arena floor. Shadows thickened into shapes. Massive, shifting forms that defied geometry, eyes where there should be none. The walls seemed to breathe. The ceiling curved impossibly, bending the rules of the world. The gods had answered. The slaves were caught between awe and terror. Some screamed. Some collapsed. Some wept. But the survivor, the immortal slave, lifted his head and spoke aloud. "We are not yours to break." The gods tilted their attention fully. The arena shook, stone cracked. Blood flowed upward along the walls, defying gravity, forming patterns too complex for human eyes. A storm of shadows and whispers erupted, swirling around the slaves. The pressure on their minds intensified, pain, terror, and understanding simultaneously. One by one, the chosen realized the horrifying truth. The gods did not simply watch. They tested, taught, and reshaped the world through suffering. Every scream, every act of defiance, every choice had been recorded. They were now part of a cosmic lesson far older than humanity, and the gods were amused, or intrigued, perhaps hungry. Lightning flashed, not in the sky but inside the arena itself. Shadows convulsed. The ground trembled. And the immortal slave realized that this confrontation was no longer just about survival. It was a battle of wills, a test to see if mortals could challenge divinity itself. The priests ran, chanting words that had lost their power. The arena obeyed no human law. The damned marched, trembling yet defiant. And above it all, the gods answered with a presence so immense, so absolute, that the very air seemed to shatter. For the first time in eternity, the slaves understood fear like never before. Not the fear of death, not the fear of pain. The fear of being seen, measured, and manipulated by beings older than time. The immortal slave raised his hands. "If you will watch, then we will move. If you will learn, then we will teach. If you will destroy, then we will endure." The gods leaned closer. Silence returned, but it was heavier than before. The first words of eternity had been spoken. And the game, the cosmic blood game of the ancient gods, had truly begun. The arena was no longer the world the slaves had known. Stone gave way to void. Shadows became solid. Air itself warped around them, bending and twisting as though reality had broken. The gods had moved beyond observation. They had reached out, shaping a realm where mortals could confront the impossible. The immortal slave led them into this new world, a place that existed above, below, and beyond the known earth. Towers of black stone spiraled into nothingness. Rivers of molten shadows flowed against gravity. Stars blinked in impossible formations overhead, forming patterns that spoke directly to the mind. The slaves were terrified, but alive. Every heartbeat was a drum, every breath a challenge. The god's presence was all-encompassing, a cold, incomprehensible intelligence that observed their every move. And then the war began. Not with swords or spears alone, but with forces older than time itself. The gods twisted the ground beneath them, forcing the damned to fight in shifting landscapes. Stone erupted as massive fists. Shadows lunged with sharpened edges. Reality bent to crush them. Yet the slaves adapted. Pain had taught them rhythm. Fear had sharpened instinct. Every strike they endured became knowledge, every fall a lesson in survival. The immortal slave moved at the center, unyielding. Each action seemed to echo in the godly minds. The watchers recoiled, intrigued, and alarmed. For centuries, no mortal had endured this level of scrutiny. For centuries, no mortal had fought back. The priests were useless. Their chants dissolved into the void, meaningless against the power of beings older than stars. And yet the damned pressed forward. Chains broken. Courage reborn. Blood-stained hands raised in defiance. The realm itself responded. Shadows shifted into weapons, reality into armor. The gods hurled visions into the slaves' minds. Cities crumbling. Oceans boiling into sky. Ancestors screaming across dimensions. Yet still the slaves endured. They fought not just for survival, but for existence, identity, and defiance. Hours passed, or eternity. The gods unleashed storms of cosmic fire, rivers of shadow, and armies of unimaginable forms. But the immortal slave led them with a singular force, unbreakable will. And in the eye of this war, a terrifying truth became clear. The gods were learning from the damned, just as the damned had been learning from the gods. Each act of resistance altered the battlefield, twisted reality, and weakened the very foundation of divine expectation. Some slaves fell, lost to madness, fear, or the crushing force of godly power. Others rose, reshaped by suffering into something beyond human, beyond mortal. The immortal slave faced the first god in the void. Its form shifted endlessly, a living nightmare of stone, shadow, and thought. It spoke not in words, but in waves of pure understanding. "You survive. You defy. Why? He raised his hands, bloodied, exhausted, yet unwavering. Because we endure. Because you underestimated pain. Because we are alive. The god recoiled, not from fear but from curiosity, irritation, and an unfamiliar respect. And across the realm, the battlefield trembled. Shadows twisted, mountains shattered, rivers of molten darkness surged. By the end of the cycle, the damned had won small victories: territory, knowledge, endurance. But the gods remained, and the war was far from over. The immortal slave knew this. This was no longer a battle for survival. This was a war for the soul of humanity itself, fought on a stage where mortals were but pawns, yet pawns that could become kings. And the gods, silent yet watching, prepared to strike back with a fury beyond imagining. The air trembled with ancient fury. The arena, the void, the broken stones and molten shadows, they had all merged into one reality, a battlefield where mortals faced gods. The immortal slave and the chosen marched forward, battered, bloodied, but unbroken. Every wound carried the memory of pain, every scar a testament to defiance. The gods watched silently, until now. A thunder of impossible power shattered the void. Shadows surged like rivers of living darkness, shaping themselves into monstrous forms that clawed at mind and flesh. The gods had struck, yet the slaves moved as one. Chains were long gone. Fear had been transformed into instinct. Pain had been refined into power. And in the center, the immortal slave led them with an unyielding will, as if he were no longer human, but a weapon forged by suffering itself. The battle was endless. Stone erupted into jagged spikes. Fire rained upward. Shadows screamed. The arena itself seemed alive, feeding off the chaos, bending, breaking, and reforming. The gods spoke, not with words but with waves of pure consciousness. Their fury was absolute. You challenge eternity. You defy the order. You are nothing. The immortal slave lifted his bloodied hands. We are everything. And in that defiance, the tide turned. The chosen struck as one. Shadows were ripped apart. Stone shattered. Fire turned to ash. The gods recoiled, not from mortality but from sheer, unbroken will. The first god fell, not dead but diminished. Its form splintered into countless fragments, writhing, twisting, absorbed into the blood-soaked ground. The other gods hesitated, sensing a force they had not accounted for. Yet victory was not without cost. Many of the chosen lay fallen. Limbs broken, minds shattered, hearts stilled. Blood ran like rivers across the arena floor. The immortal slave looked upon the devastation, every face a reminder of the price of rebellion. And then a silence unlike any other. The gods, now wary and curious, observed. The arena stilled. Shadows folded into the stone. The void held its breath. The immortal slave stepped forward. He raised his hands to the heavens, or what remained of them in this fractured realm. This ends with blood. Our blood. Your lessons. Your silence. Your eternity, broken. The gods leaned closer, their unseen eyes wide with intrigue, awe, and, perhaps, the first touch of fear. The arena shook. Reality itself trembled. In the aftermath, the survivors staggered, broken but alive. The immortal slave looked at them and whispered, "We endured, we defied, and we remain." The arena below the earth, beneath the void, beneath time itself, had been transformed. No longer a prison of suffering, it had become a monument to resistance, courage, and the defiance of fate itself. The gods would remember this day. The empire above would forget. And the blood of the damned would flow through eternity, marking the first time mortals had truly challenged the divine, and lived to tell the tale. The game had ended, not in silence, not in surrender, but in blood. And in that blood, a story was written, a story that would echo through time, forever haunted by the gaze of the ancient gods.